The occasion of our sermon today is an important anniversary coming up, which, if you haven't already been hearing about it, you soon will be. August 26th is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The passage of the 19th Amendment was brought about by over 70 years of struggle and sacrifice on the part of truly heroic people, primarily, but certainly not exclusively, women. The course of that struggle was complex and, as with all things, deeply reflects America's struggle against and complicity with racism. The victory itself was painfully incomplete, but a profoundly important victory nonetheless. Now, as a white male minister preaching about women's suffrage, including its racial dimensions, I am painfully aware that I risk the charge of both mansplaining and white-splaining the women's movement, and I do not relish the idea of either. I'm addressing this sermon, however, specifically to Unitarian Universalists because it's relevant to Unitarian Universalists for two reasons. First, because this history is part of our mythology. Many of the famous feminists and suffragettes, the ones we learned about in school and hear about in stories, are claimed, mostly correctly, as Unitarians. Margaret Fuller, Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, Susan B. Anthony, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, all Unitarians, or at least significantly embedded in Unitarian circles. And as you use, we claim this struggle as part of our identity and as an expression of our commitment to justice and equality. But oftentimes, we gloss over certain realities in the mythologizing. So it's important that our telling of this story capture its complexity. The second reason this is relevant to Unitarian Universalists is because Unitarian Universalists across the country right now are embarking on projects of voter engagement, individually and then collectively through an initiative called UU the Vote. And voter engagement has been identified as a critical social justice commitment of the Unitarian Universalist Association. But how we understand and talk about our own history with women's suffrage critically impacts our ability to build coalitions across race, culture, and class. My sources for this sermon are primarily two books, Sacred Service in Civic Space by Kathleen Parker and She Votes, How U.S. Women Won Suffrage and What Came Next by Bridget Quinn, and then various other articles. To begin, Unitarian involvement in the struggle for women's rights grew out of the abolition movement. By the 1830s and 1840s, Unitarian women were already significantly involved in the fight against slavery. And so in 1840, a young woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton traveled with 8 other women as part of a large delegation of American abolitionists to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London of 1840. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was both a religious freethinker and a feminist, and she had already felt the burden of societal inequality, especially in regards to the pursuit of her own education. And when she married her husband that same year, 1840, journalist and anti-slavery activist Henry Stanton, she retained her birth name, Cady, and she had the minister remove any promise to obey from the marriage vows. Bridget Quinn notes that it tells you everything you need to know about the young couple, that they spent their honeymoon on a trip to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. But unfortunately, when the American women arrived, the British men were appalled at the presence of women. But they felt the need to make some compromise since the women had, after all, crossed an ocean to be there. And so the compromise was the women were allowed to be seated in a corner, hidden behind a curtain where they could listen but not participate in the proceedings. And 25-year-old Elizabeth Cady Stanton recalled that burning indignation filled her soul. Burning indignation filled her soul. And at the convention, she met Lucretia Mott, the Quaker firebrand anti-slavery orator who was once threatened by a mob with having her house burned down for the offense of being a woman speaking in public. And Mott and Katie Stanton began planning a convention for the rights of women when they returned to America. It took them 8 years to bring their convention to fruition at Seneca Falls in 1848. And there they delivered their historic Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, which demanded equal rights for women. And those demands included the right to vote. And it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton who inserted this demand, and this demand was so shockingly beyond the bounds of conventional social roles for women that her husband actually left town so he would not have to hear it discussed. And the other organizers, including the women organizers, protested that they would be ridiculed and dismissed just for bringing it up. Even Lucretia Mott thought this was going too far, asking for the right to vote for women. But the demand stayed in, and it received support from an important ally. Prior to the Civil War, feminists and abolitionists made common cause and were often the same people. There was no racial barrier to cooperation. The Seneca Falls Convention featured as one of its keynote speakers the great Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved Black man who by this time was a best-selling author and famous anti-slavery speaker. Douglass is perhaps most famous for his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." But on this day, he was speaking on behalf of women's rights, and in particular, he put the full weight of his moral authority behind the right for women to vote. And had he not, the resolution might not have passed. It passed. At Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan B. Anthony, and the two forged a partnership that would last for decades. Cady Stanton was the writer, and Anthony was the orator. Or as Cady Stanton put it, "I forged the thunderbolts, and she fired them." And from this point on, abolitionism and women's rights became increasingly intertwined in a partnership that continued to cross racial lines. 3 years after Seneca Falls, at the second Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, Sojourner Truth spoke at the Old Stone Universalist Church. Truth, of course, had made a name for herself as an abolitionist, and now she was expanding her crusade to the cause of women, including Black women. This was the occasion of Sojourner Truth's famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech, which is almost certainly not what she actually said. This is the account of Truth's speech recorded the next day by a friend. That Truth said, "I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man now. The poor men seem all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have women's rights, give them to her, and you will feel much better." End quote. A decade later, a white man delivered a different account of this speech for a publication, and this account had Truth speaking in the folksy dialect that most children now learn in school, "Ain't I a woman?" But this was most likely a racist invention, and not the voice of Sojourner Truth herself. Now, when the Civil War arrived, feminist agitation was put on hold, as all efforts were organized towards winning the war. The end of slavery was a triumphant victory that had feminists primed for the next obvious step in human liberation. But then things took a turn after the Civil War. Things took an ugly turn. The 14th Amendment said that all male citizens, 21 and older, could vote. And Quinn notes that this was the first mention of gender in the Constitution, explicitly creating two categories of citizen based on sex. The 15th Amendment further specified that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, but left it open that it could be denied based on sex. And it was clear that the voting rights that had been won for Black men would not be extended at this time to women. So, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony responded to this turn of events by rejecting the 15th Amendment with bitterly racist rhetoric. They began making common cause with the most extreme Southern racists in a bid to advance the cause of women's voting. In a prominent tour of the Southern states, for example, they argued that giving the vote to white women would be an effective way of neutralizing the newly won vote of Black men. Their organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association, reflected these racist attitudes and commitments. But not all feminists responded in this way. The question of race and racism split the women's movement. Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, Frederick Douglass, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and others founded a separate organization called the American Women's Suffrage Association, which supported the 15th Amendment while continuing to advocate for all women's rights, Black and white alike. In a famous 1866 speech titled "We Are All Bound Up Together," Frances Ellen Watkins Harper urged white women suffragettes not to exclude Black women from their cause, arguing that Black women faced a double burden of racism and sexism. For decades, the two organizations, the NWSA and the AWSA, worked in parallel. At the same time, Black women, including Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Ida B. Wells, began organizing Black women's clubs to advocate for their rights, including voting rights. And the work became increasingly segregated, reflecting the abandonment of the cause of full and equal rights for Black people by white progressives after Reconstruction. At the dawn of the 20th century, the two organizations, the NWSA and the AWSA, were reunified again. But the new organization began sidelining the voices of Black women in the movement, afraid that it would hurt their cause with white men. And other suffragette leaders were explicitly racist, not just strategically racist. This was the early 20th century, after all. In 1913, Ida B. Wells brought members of her Alpha Suffrage Club to the National Suffrage March in Washington, D.C. The Alpha Suffrage Club was the first suffrage club in the nation for Black women, organized among Black women in Chicago. And when they got to D.C., they were instructed to march at the back of the parade. In response, Ida B. Wells disappeared into the crowd before reappearing to take her place in the front of the parade, marching in between two surprised white suffragettes. Now, the history of suffragism here in Indiana follows a similar pattern. In a March 2020 Indy Maven article titled "The Black Women Suffragists of Indiana" by Leah Namias, we read that the Indiana suffrage movement was integrated prior to the Civil War. She writes, I quote, "Black women attended suffrage conventions throughout the 1850s in Indiana. And one unnamed Black woman in the records even asked the white women if they were talking about her right to vote, and she was told yes. And Naomi Bowman Talbot Anderson, who was a Black woman, toured the Midwest in the 1860s and 1870s, calling for equal rights regardless of race or gender," end quote. But by the turn of the century, efforts in Indiana had segregated, as in the rest of the nation. In the 1910s, an African-American woman from Evansville named Betty Ola Fortson moved to Chicago, where she became second vice president of Ida B. Wells's Alpha Club. Here in Indy, branch number 7 of the Equal Suffrage Club met in the home of Madam C.J. Walker, the pioneering African-American businesswoman. Namias says branch number 7 was the first suffrage organization in Indianapolis led entirely by Black women and men. African-American branches were also documented in Terre Haute and Marion. It took 72 years of tireless, heroic advocacy from 1848 to 1920 for women to win the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And in the decade running up to its passage, women of all ages, classes, races, and backgrounds took to the streets, marched on the White House, orchestrated a relentless campaign of public protest and civil disobedience. And as the price they paid, they were beaten, abused, arrested, consigned to mental institutions, and literally tortured. It is a tale of heroes who were also just ordinary people, but ordinary people on fire with an idea, burning for justice. And it is a story, like all American stories, complicated by racism and often tarnished by it. And this is nowhere clearer than in the immediate impact of the amendment itself. Here in Indiana, when the 19th Amendment was passed, Black and white women alike won the right to vote. In Columbus, Indiana, the very first women to register to vote were African American. But in other parts of the country, of course, Black women and other women of color were barred from voting. Native American women could not vote until 1924. Chinese immigrants were denied citizenship and thus the right to vote until 1943. Indian immigrants until 1946. Japanese immigrants until 1952. And Black women did not win the right to vote everywhere until 1965. So you can imagine how painfully it may fall in some women's ears if we just describe the 19th Amendment uncritically as, oh yeah, that was the amendment that gave women the right to vote. Today, despite guarantees of equal voting rights for all people, securing the access to the vote requires as much vigilance as ever and calls for renewed activism. Michelle Alexander has written in The New Jim Crow how mass incarceration has led to disenfranchisement on a mass scale, primarily targeting people of color. And recent elections have seen aggressive attempts at voter suppression, which has never gone away, but has been emboldened by the recent Supreme Court gutting of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This voter suppression typically targets marginalized communities through tactics like voter ID laws, restrictions on registration, mass purges of the voting rolls, restricted access to polling places in certain communities, and gerrymandering. People with disabilities also often face special obstacles to voting. The ACLU notes that 70% of Georgia voters purged in 2018 were Black. Across the country, 1 in 13 Black Americans cannot vote due to disenfranchisement laws. 1/3 of voters who have a disability report difficulty voting. Only 40% of polling places fully accommodate people with disabilities. And across the country, counties with larger minority populations have fewer polling sites and poll workers per voter. It is a core value of Unitarian Universalism, reflected in our 5th principle, that all people ought to have a say in the decisions that impact their lives. Access to voting is a basic justice issue. And the story of the suffrage movement tells us that ordinary people can make history when they stay committed to their values. And it also tells us that the course of change is never easy or smooth, and that people will always seek to divide us along the way. Today, it is more important than ever that we stick together and insist on an inclusive vision that demands justice for everyone. Or as the Reverend Teresa Soto says, all of us need all of us to make it. The UU the Vote campaign proudly declares, from our work for marriage equality, women's suffrage, the abolition of slavery, for civil and voting rights, to advocating for a path to citizenship for immigrants, to taking on the new Jim Crow and white supremacy today, Unitarian Universalists have a legacy to carry onward. And UUI will be a part of that legacy with our own voter engagement initiatives. To learn more or to volunteer for these initiatives, email me at ministry@uui.org and I will connect you to our team leads. The right to vote is sacred, sanctified by the dreams and sacrifices of so many. Let us celebrate the work of our ancestors, the brave and bold people who carried us forward, and let us honor their struggle by continuing the work in our own time. Blessed be, and amen.